Michael Jordan walked into an exclusive restaurant, expecting a quiet meal. But the waiter took one look at him and scoffed. "Sir, we don't serve people dressed like that." Conversations paused, forks hovered midair, and amused whispers spread across the room. But Jordan, he didn't argue. He just smirked, because he knew something they didn't. What happened next left the entire restaurant in shock, flipped the rules of luxury upside down, and taught an unforgettable lesson in respect. Stay till the end, because this story is one you won't forget. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. "Sir, this is a high-class establishment," the waiter sneered, looking Jordan up and down with thinly veiled disdain. "We have a dress code." Michael Jordan didn't flinch. He had faced down the toughest defenders in the world, stared pressure in the face on the biggest stages, and come out on top. But this was a different kind of game. He had walked into La Maison Royale, a fine dining paradise reserved for billionaires, royalty, and industry titans. The kind of place where wealth wasn't just displayed, it was a weapon. Massive chandeliers sparkled above polished marble floors, expensive wine glasses clinked as high-profile guests whispered about stock markets and private jets. Jordan stood in stark contrast to the restaurant's usual clientele. He wasn't dressed in a tailored suit or dripping in designer labels. Instead, he wore loose-fitting jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and a black baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. To the untrained eye, he looked like just another guy, not the billionaire basketball icon sitting atop a $2.2 billion empire. A young, overly confident waiter named Brian smirked as he stepped forward, his eyes scanning Jordan's outfit with clear judgment. "Can I help you?" Brian asked, folding his arms. Jordan met his gaze with an easy smile. "Yeah, I'll have the Wagyu steak, medium rare." Brian let out a small chuckle, as if amused by the audacity. "Oh, I don't think you understand," he said, tilting his head slightly. "This isn't McDonald's." A few nearby guests overheard the comment, their amused glances flickering toward Jordan. A couple in the corner exchanged whispers, while a businessman at a nearby table smirked behind his wineglass. Jordan, unfazed, raised an eyebrow. "Did I ask for a happy meal?" A soft gasp rippled through the tables, close enough to hear. A woman choked on her champagne. A man in an expensive suit leaned back, suddenly interested in what was unfolding. Brian's smirk faltered for a second before he straightened up, regaining his composure. His expression shifted into something colder, more authoritative. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, crossing his arms, "but we have a strict policy. No baggy clothes allowed." The entire restaurant fell silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Jordan's smile didn't fade, but there was something in his eyes now. Something Brian should have noticed before opening his mouth. The laughter started small, just a few quiet chuckles, but it spread quickly, rolling through the restaurant like wildfire. Brian, feeding off the attention, straightened his posture and spoke louder, making sure every guest in the restaurant could hear. "I said, we have a strict dress code here. No baggy clothes, no streetwear, no exceptions." His voice carried through the high ceilings of La Maison Royale, bouncing off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Nearby diners nodded in approval. A businessman in a tailored Armani suit leaned back in his chair, smirking as he swirled his wine. A woman draped in a silk gown raised an eyebrow, whispering something to her dinner companion. Even the maître d', who had been silently observing from the entrance, gave the slightest approving nod. Jordan, however, remained completely unfazed. He didn't shift uncomfortably. He didn't frown or protest. He simply stood there, calm, collected, unreadable. The very essence of a man who had been in bigger battles, under brighter lights, facing tougher opponents. With an effortless motion, he adjusted the brim of his baseball cap, tilting it back just slightly before speaking. "So you're saying," Jordan said, his voice smooth and level, "I can't eat here because of my clothes?" Brian's smirk widened. The arrogance in his expression was almost cartoonish, as if he had just won a battle he didn't even realize he was losing. Crossing his arms over his chest, he nodded. "Exactly." The way he said it, so sure of himself, so convinced that this moment would end the way all the others had, with someone leaving embarrassed, was almost comical. For a moment, Jordan didn't respond. He simply exhaled softly, his expression shifting just enough to reveal something subtle. Not anger, not frustration, but amusement. He leaned in slightly, his massive frame making the distance between them feel smaller. his presence alone shifting the weight of the room. You sure about that? The words were simple, but something about them made the air feel heavier. The confidence in his tone, the way he spoke as if he already knew the outcome, was enough to make Brian hesitate, just for a split second. But pride is a dangerous thing. Brian quickly recovered, laughing loudly in a way that felt just a little too forced. His eyes darted toward the wealthy guest still watching, waiting for him to put this man in his place. He wasn't about to let some nobody in baggy jeans intimidate him. "Buddy," Brian said, shaking his head with a smug grin, "I'd bet my job on it." The laughter swelled again, rippling through the restaurant. But what Brian didn't know was that he had just made the worst bet of his life. The moment Jordan pulled out his phone, the energy in the room shifted. Up until now, the entire restaurant had been laughing at him. Brian had been riding a wave of smug arrogance. The wealthy diners had been enjoying their entertainment, and even the Metro D had seemed content to let the scene play out. But now, everything felt different. Jordan moved slowly, reaching into his pocket with the kind of ease that only came from absolute confidence. His massive hands gripped his phone as he swiped the screen open and pressed a contact without hesitation. Brian, still standing with his arms crossed, let out an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, what now?" he muttered, rolling his eyes. "You gonna Yelp review us out of business?" A few guests chuckled, but their laughter lacked the same energy as before. Something about the way Jordan moved, so calm, so unbothered, had made them uneasy. The restaurant manager, Pierre, had been standing a few feet away, watching silently. Unlike Brian, Pierre had been in the business long enough to know when something wasn't right. And right now, something about Jordan's demeanor told him that this wasn't a situation to take lightly. Jordan didn't even glance at Brian. He simply lifted the phone to his ear, speaking in a voice so casual it was almost unsettling. "Yeah, it's Mike," he said smoothly. "I need a favor." A beat of silence. Then he continued, "How much is La Maison Royale worth?" The entire restaurant fell quiet. Pierre's breath hitched. A waiter dropping off a wine bottle at a table froze mid-pour. Even the bartender, who had been polishing glasses absent-mindedly, stopped and looked up. Brian let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Wait, what?" he scoffed. "You're joking, right?" Jordan ignored him, his eyes locked straight ahead, waiting for a response from the person on the other end of the line. Brian shook his head, trying to keep the upper hand. "Dude, what are you even doing? Calling corporate? Complaining to the owner?" He scoffed again, shaking his head in mock pity. "Hate to break it to you, but no one's gonna—" Then Jordan put the call on speaker. The voice that came through was deep, professional, and shockingly direct. "Actually, Mr. Jordan," a slight pause. "It's all ready for sale." Brian's smirk vanished. Pierre's face drained of color. The reality of the situation was about to hit them like a freight train. Brian's smirk vanished the second Jordan put the call on speaker. The restaurant, once filled with quiet laughter and murmured conversations, had gone completely silent. Every guest, every waiter, even the bartender behind the marble counter, had stopped moving. The air inside La Maison Royale felt heavier now, as if the weight of reality had just settled in. The voice on the other end of the phone was steady, composed, and unmistakably serious. "Actually, Mr. Jordan, it's already for sale." A few audible gasps rippled through the room. Pierre, the restaurant manager, stiffened, his expression flickering between shock and pure dread. His hands instinctively clenched at his sides like a man watching an oncoming disaster and realizing he couldn't stop it. Brian, on the other hand, let out a forced, nervous laugh. "Oh, come on, you're not actually serious," he scoffed, but there was a distinct tremor in his voice. "What, you're gonna buy this place? Just like that?" He gestured around, trying to regain control, as if the very idea was too absurd to believe. Jordan, still calm, still completely unreadable, tilted his head slightly and asked the one question that sent a shockwave through the room. "How much?" Another pause. Then the voice on the line responded, "We can discuss final numbers, but the current valuation sits at around $21 million. A collective hush fell over the restaurant. Even the wealthiest patrons, the ones used to tossing around millions like spare change, were holding their breath. This wasn't some bluff. This was a power move unfolding in real time. Brian swallowed hard. His posture, which had been cocky and relaxed just minutes ago, had stiffened. You're joking, right?" His laughter this time wasn't confident. It was hopeful, desperate. "You're not really considering this. You can't be. Jordan turned to him slowly, his eyes locked onto Brian's with a level of intensity that sent a chill down the younger man's spine. I never joke about business. The words were spoken so effortlessly, so casually, yet they carried more weight than anything Brian had ever heard. The realization of what was happening hit him all at once. He had been laughing at a man who could buy his entire existence with a single phone call. Pierre, still standing near the host podium, suddenly looked panicked. He had worked at La Maison Royale for years, but if this deal went through, his entire world was about to change. And fast. A single signature, and the restaurant belonged to Jordan? The tension in La Maison Royale had reached its breaking point. The once lively and exclusive fine dining establishment, filled with the hum of whispered conversations and clinking wine glasses, had now fallen into absolute silence. Every eye in the room was locked onto Michael Jordan, who sat effortlessly at his table, exuding an aura of calm control. Brian, the once smug waiter, stood frozen, his face pale, his mouth slightly open as if his brain was struggling to process the nightmare unfolding before him. He had thought this was just a regular customer, some out-of-place man trying to push his luck. He had thought his insults were harmless, his mockery just another day on the job. He had never imagined that the man he had dismissed so easily would be the one to buy the entire restaurant right out from under him. Then Jordan's phone buzzed. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled it from his pocket and answered, his voice just as smooth and composed as before. "Yeah," he said casually, leaning back in his chair. The voice on the other end was crisp, direct. "It's done. You own La Maison Royale." The entire restaurant held its breath. Even the waitstaff, trained to move seamlessly between tables without disturbing guests, had stopped in place. The maître d' stood rigid by the entrance, while a chef peeked nervously from the kitchen doors. Brian's hands twitched at his sides. His breathing had become shallow, and for the first time since this all started, his expression was completely unreadable. Jordan, still leaning back, let the words sink in. He glanced around the room, eyes flickering from the stunned faces of wealthy guests to the wide-eyed staff who had just realized everything had changed. Then he smiled. "So, about that dress code, a single sentence, but it carried the weight of 1,000 lessons. The people who had laughed minutes ago weren't laughing anymore. Brian, who had taken so much pride in enforcing the restaurant's exclusivity, now looked like he wanted to disappear. Pierre, the manager, who had been standing stiff near the podium, suddenly found his voice. He swallowed hard, stepping forward cautiously. His expression was a mix of fear, uncertainty, and the realization that his job now depended on the very man his staff had just disrespected. In a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Sir, what do you want to do first as owner?" The question hung in the air, because everyone in that restaurant knew, whatever came next, it wouldn't be what they expected. Brian had no idea how badly he had just messed up. Just minutes ago, he had been standing tall, wearing a smug grin, humiliating a man he assumed didn't belong. Now that same man was sitting comfortably, owning everything around him, while Brian's entire world began to collapse in slow motion. The room still hadn't recovered from the shock. The guests, once entertained by Brian's arrogance, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing between their wine glasses and their phones, debating whether to continue their meals or pretend they weren't witnessing the fall of a man in real time. Michael Jordan tapped his fingers lightly on the table, studying Brian like a coach evaluating a player who had just made a career-ending mistake. His expression was unreadable, but the silence that followed his last words carried a weight no one in the room could ignore. Finally, Jordan spoke, his voice calm but cutting like a knife. "You bet your job on this, right?" Brian's face drained of color. I didn't mean," he stammered, his once confident voice now shaky. His hands twitched at his sides, his usual smirk completely gone. It was as if he had just realized he had been playing a game he was never meant to win. Jordan didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned to Pierre, the manager, and gave a small nod. "Fire him." Pierre froze. His jaw clenched slightly, and his eyes darted toward Brian, who had gone completely still. Pierre had been in the industry long enough to know when power had shifted, and right now Jordan was the only man in the room who mattered. Brian let out a nervous laugh, one that didn't match the sheer panic creeping into his features. "Wait, hold on," he said quickly, holding up his hands. "This is a joke, right? You're messing with me." Jordan didn't respond. He simply leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Brian. Pierre inhaled sharply, then, in a low voice, made it official. Brian, you're dismissed from your position, effective immediately. The words hit like a thunderclap. Brian's body locked up. His breathing grew uneven as his head snapped toward Pierre. No, 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 wait! You can't be serious. His voice had risen, losing all composure. I was just following policy. I didn't know. He took an instinctive step back, right into security. Two suited security guards stepped forward, their expressions unreadable as they closed in. Brian's panic reached its peak. Wait, you can't do this. But deep down he knew it was already done. Brian had gone from arrogant to desperate in seconds. Just minutes ago, he was the one holding power, belittling a man he thought didn't belong. Now that same man owned everything around him, and Brian stood on the verge of losing everything. His heart pounded as the weight of the moment crashed down on him. Wait, please, Brian stammered, his voice shaky, no longer laced with smug confidence. It was just a joke, man. I didn't mean anything by it. His hands lifted slightly in surrender, desperation seeping into every syllable. Jordan, still seated, tilted his head slightly, as if considering Brian's words. He studied him with the same sharp, analytical gaze he once used to break defenders on the court. But there was no mercy in his expression, only certainty. Nah, Jordan finally said, shaking his head slowly. See, respect ain't a joke. Brian's lips parted, but no words came out. He could feel the stares of everyone in the restaurant, the guests who had once laughed with him now watching in stunned silence, the waitstaff whispering among themselves, wondering who else might be next. The murmurs spread through the employees. A few waiters exchanged nervous glances. A busboy shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to keep clearing plates or stand frozen in place. The head chef peeked out from the kitchen doors, sensing that whatever was happening was far bigger than a dress code dispute. Brian's breathing grew erratic. He turned desperately to Pierre, the manager, the man he had always tried to impress. Pierre, he gasped, trying to compose himself. You know me, man. You know I was just enforcing policy, right? Pierre's expression was unreadable. He had worked in this industry long enough to know when to pick his battles. And this wasn't a battle he could win. Mr. Jordan owns the restaurant now, Pierre said simply. His voice was firm, professional, cold. Brian's stomach dropped. He turned back to Jordan, his panic spiraling. I can change, all right? I'll do better. You don't have to do this. Jordan exhaled, almost as if he was bored of the conversation. Brian, the ex-waiter flinched at the sound of his own name. This ain't personal. It's just business. Security stepped forward, their presence looming. Brian took a frantic step back, his face pale. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be the one calling the shots, the one laughing, the one in control. But Jordan wasn't done yet. He had more changes to make, and the rest of the staff was about to find out who was staying and who was next. Jordan had one more surprise for everyone in the restaurant. The air inside Le Maison Royale was still thick with tension. Brian was gone, dragged out by security, his protests fading into the night. The restaurant staff stood frozen, waiting, while the wealthy patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the experience they had signed up for. Jordan remained seated, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to feel it, to understand that things were different now. Then he stood. The towering presence of the basketball legend alone was enough to command attention. But it wasn't just his height. It was the way he carried himself. Confident, unshaken, completely in control. He adjusted his watch, then scanned the room before speaking. From now on, he said, his voice even and clear, Le Maison Royale is about excellence, not appearances. A few guests exchanged glances, unsure how to react. One man in a navy suit let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head. Ridiculous, the man muttered, standing up and tossing his napkin onto the table. This place used to mean something. A woman in a designer gown stood with him, rolling her eyes as she grabbed her handbag. Exactly. If anyone can just walk in here now, what's even the point? Jordan didn't stop them. He didn't flinch when they walked past him, leaving behind their half-finished meals and expensive cocktails. But as they left, something unexpected happened. A few guests started to clap. At first it was hesitant, a slow, uncertain sound. But then more joined in. Diners who had seen what happened, who had watched the humiliation unfold, who understood that change wasn't always a bad thing. One older gentleman leaned forward in his chair, smiling slightly. "Finally," he said under his breath. Pierre, the manager, stood off to the side, his shoulders tense. He had spent years keeping La Maison Royale exactly the way the owners had demanded. Exclusive, untouchable. Now in just one night, everything had changed. He exhaled, his shoulders finally relaxing. This place needed a change, Pierre muttered to himself. Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, Brian stood on the sidewalk. His expensive uniform, the same one he had worn with such arrogance, now felt useless. His reflection in the restaurant's glass windows showed him exactly what he was, an outsider looking in. As Brian watched in humiliation, Jordan turned to the staff. "All right," he said, "let's talk about how we do things from now on." Brian wasn't ready to let it go just yet. Outside La Maison Royale, the cool night air bit at his skin, but the chill that ran through him had nothing to do with the weather. His mind was spinning, replaying everything that had just happened. One minute, he had been in control, laughing, enforcing policies meant to keep certain people out. The next, he was being dragged out of the very place he had ruled over for years. Humiliation burned deep in his chest. He had spent years climbing the ranks in the hospitality world, believing himself superior to those he served. Now, thanks to one man, he had become a nobody, jobless, embarrassed, a spectacle for the entire restaurant to watch. But he wasn't going to take this lying down. Fumbling with his phone, he opened his contacts and dialed the first number that came to mind. A local journalist he knew from high-profile events. "Hey man, I got a story for you." The next morning, headlines exploded across the internet. NBA legend humiliates employee in shocking restaurant takeover. Michael Jordan abuses power. Fires hard-working waiter in cold blood. Ex-employee speaks out. "Jordan ruined my life." Brian sat back watching it unfold, his lips curled into a satisfied smirk. The media loved a good, rich guy abusing his power story, and if he played his cards right, maybe he could even get sympathy and a new job out of it. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on. The internet wasn't buying it. At first, the headlines gained traction, but then the videos surfaced. Clips of the actual incident, Brian's smug insults, the way he had laughed at Jordan, the moment he bet his job on it, spread across social media. The truth was impossible to ignore. Jordan justice began trending worldwide. People ripped Brian apart in the comments. Dude literally asked for it. He said, "I'd bet my job on it." Well, he lost. This man had the audacity to laugh at Jordan, and now he's playing victim? LMAO. Karma works fast when you mess with the GOAT. Major news stations backtracked. The same journalists who had originally painted Jordan as the villain now ran revised reports. Brian's plan had backfired spectacularly. And through it all, Jordan? He stayed silent. That is, until a news anchor, live on national television, finally turned to Jordan and asked, "Sir, do you have anything to say about Brian's accusations?" Jordan leaned forward, ready to speak. The world held its breath. Everyone waited to see if Jordan would destroy Brian publicly. The controversy had reached its peak. News anchors debated the story on primetime television. Twitter threads dissected every moment from the viral videos, and late-night talk show hosts turned it into their newest joke. Would Michael Jordan fire back? Would he crush Brian's accusations with the same precision he once used to dismantle opponents on the court? The world waited, and then the moment came. Seated in a sleek, modern studio, Jordan faced a panel of reporters. Cameras were rolling. The internet was watching. The question had just been asked. "Michael, Brian claims you ruined his life over a simple misunderstanding. He says you took things too far. What do you have to say?" A beat of silence. Jordan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His expression was calm, unreadable, the look of a man who had nothing to prove, yet always proved everything. Then finally he spoke. "I don't care about revenge. I care about respect." The room fell dead silent. "I didn't fire Brian because he insulted me. I fired him because he disrespected someone he didn't even know. He thought a man's worth was in his clothes. He thought the way someone looked determined whether they belonged. That's not how I do business." His voice was smooth, controlled, but there was weight behind every word. He made a bet. He lost. The reporters sat stunned. They had expected something different. Anger, pettiness, maybe even an attack. Instead, Jordan was above it all. People are asking if I regret what I did. Jordan exhaled, shaking his head slightly. The answer is no, because this was never about me. It was about a lesson he needed to learn. One of the reporters leaned in. So, are you saying you don't hold any grudges? Jordan let out a quiet chuckle, a small smirk playing at his lips. I don't waste time on grudges. I'd rather win. The response was instantaneous. Social media erupted with praise. This man just ended Brian without even trying. GOAT mentality. No revenge, just facts. Jordan is different. He let the world drag Brian while he just kept moving forward. Major outlets started changing their headlines. Instead of Michael Jordan under fire for restaurant takeover, they now read, Michael Jordan teaches a masterclass in respect. Jordan proves why he's not just a champion on the court. Brian, watching the interview from his apartment, felt his stomach drop. Jordan hadn't destroyed him, but somehow that made it even worse. The man who once laughed at Jordan was now struggling to find a job. Brian sat at his tiny apartment's kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen, refreshing his inbox for the 100th time. No new emails, no responses, nothing. His fingers hovered over the trackpad, his heartbeat thudding against his ribs. He clicked open another tab, scrolling through job listings. Each one felt like a slap to the face. Not a good fit. We're looking for someone with better customer service experience. That last one stung. Customer service. That was supposed to be his thing. He had spent years working his way up, believing himself to be better than the people he served. He had worn his arrogance like a badge of honor. And now? Now no one wanted to hire him. The moment his name was searched, the headlines popped up. Former waiter who mocked Michael Jordan gets fired on the spot. Brian, the viral ex-waiter, says he was unfairly treated. The internet disagrees. He had tried to control the narrative, but social media had made sure the world never forgot what happened. One viral moment had cost him everything. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. His savings were drying up. Rent was due. Even the arrogance that once fueled him had disappeared, replaced by exhaustion, regret, and something else he wasn't ready to admit. Meanwhile, across town, Le Maison Royale had transformed. Under Jordan's ownership, the restaurant was no longer just a symbol of exclusivity. It had become something bigger, better. The same luxury, the same elegance. But now anyone could walk in and be judged on their presence, their character, their respect, not their outfit or their bank account. Critics had scoffed at first. You can't redefine fine dining, they wrote. But Jordan proved them wrong. Celebrity chefs lined up to collaborate. High-profile investors wanted in. Le Maison Royale became the first fine dining restaurant to break tradition and set new standards. And Brian? He watched it all from the outside. He saw the headlines. He saw the social media praise. He saw what he could have been part of, if only he had treated people differently. The realization sat heavy on his chest. After staring at the blank document on his screen for what felt like forever, he finally started typing. Brian, humbled and out of options, wrote Jordan a letter. But would Jordan even read it? Jordan had one final move left to play. The letter sat on his desk for days before he decided to read it. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs. No excuses, no justifications, just a simple acknowledgement of what had happened. An apology. Brian, once so sure of himself, had written words Jordan never thought he'd see. I was wrong. I judge people based on the wrong things. I know I don't deserve another chance, but if you're willing to meet, I'd like to say this to you in person. Jordan didn't owe Brian anything. He had already won. He had already proven his point. But something about the letter stuck with him. So he agreed. Brian sat at a quiet table in La Maison Royale, looking out of place in a way he never had before. Gone was the smug arrogance. Gone was the sharp-tongued attitude. He wasn't in a crisp uniform, standing tall with an air of superiority. Now he just looked like a man trying to rebuild himself. When Jordan walked in, Brian immediately stood, hands fidgeting as if unsure whether to shake hands or apologize first. Jordan simply gestured for him to sit. Silence stretched between them for a few moments before Brian finally spoke. I don't expect forgiveness, he admitted, voice low. I needed you to know I get it now. Jordan studied him for a moment, leaning back in his chair. What is it you think you get? Brian swallowed hard, choosing his next words carefully. Respect. It's not about money, not about status. He exhaled, shaking his head. It's how you treat people. Jordan nodded slowly. letting the words settle between them. Then, without a hint of smugness or satisfaction, he slid a neatly folded piece of paper across the table. Brian hesitated before picking it up, unfolding it with careful hands. His eyes widened as he read. A job offer, dishwasher. Brian's throat tightened. I don't understand. Jordan leaned forward. You said you learned something, right? He tapped the paper. Then prove it. Brian looked at the offer again. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't anything close to what he had before, but it was a start. He let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the paper. Then finally, he nodded. As Brian shook Jordan's hand, humbled and grateful, Jordan gave him one final lesson. Respect isn't given, it's earned.